Britain just made Russia's missile campaign more expensive. And Putin didn't get a say. $205 million didn't go to Kyiv in crates. It went into a NATO procurement system designed to keep Russian missiles from landing at all. That changes the math of the air war. Because Moscow's strike strategy isn't just about destruction, it's about pressure. Every cruise missile, every drone swarm carries a message. Ukraine cannot protect everything. The sky will eventually fail. If enough weapons get through, that message becomes believable. Britain just attacked the credibility of that message. The £150 million contribution flows into NATO's prioritized Ukraine requirements list, PURL, a standing purchase mechanism built to move US-made interceptors and critical munitions without waiting for political theatrics. Patriot interceptors sit inside that channel. HIMARS-linked munitions sit inside it. These are not symbolic tools. They determine whether a strike wave produces damage or disappears on radar. This is the first time London has entered that system. Other allies had already poured billions into it. The UK stepped in now, as Russian strike packages have become more layered and more deliberate. That timing matters. Russia's current air model relies on saturation. Drones are launched to provoke defensive fire. Cruise missiles follow. Ballistic threats complicate the picture. The objective is overload. Force enough decisions at once, and eventually something slips through. That method only works when defenders feel constrained. Britain just loosened that constraint. A Patriot interceptor costs millions. A drone costs a fraction of that. Russia uses cheaper threats to trigger expensive responses. If Ukraine is forced to burn high-end interceptors early, the balance tilts in Moscow's favor. Layered defense breaks that trap, and this is where the rest of Britain's package becomes critical. Beyond the PURL funding sits a broader £500 million framework focused on air defense and artillery. Thousands of lightweight multi-role missiles built in Belfast will support short-range systems designed to eliminate drones before they force Patriot crews to react. That separation preserves hierarchy. Short-range systems handle drones. Higher-tier interceptors stay reserved for cruise and ballistic threats. The defensive structure holds. Russia's strike design tries to blur that structure until everything feels urgent at once. This package restores order to that grid, and restoring order changes the battlefield in ways that are not immediately visible on maps. Putin has leaned heavily on long-range strikes because they offer leverage without territorial risk. Missiles do not require holding ground. They do not require explaining stalled offensives. They create darkness instead. Darkness has political value. When Ukrainian power grids fail in winter, debates intensify across Europe. Questions about endurance surface. The impression of vulnerability becomes a strategic asset for Moscow. Britain just made it harder for Putin to weaponize winter. Because air defense is not only about protecting infrastructure, it is about protecting confidence. For much of this war, Western support arrived in visible waves shaped by summits and political debates. Russia watched for pauses. Pauses create doubt. Doubt amplifies pressure. PURL reduces pauses. Money enters the channel. Orders move to production lines. Interceptors move toward deployment without waiting for another headline. Continuity undermines a strategy built on waiting for fatigue. Putin has framed this conflict as a test of Western stamina. Energy crises and funding disputes appeared to support that narrative. The idea was simple: time favors Moscow. This move signals something different. It signals structured endurance. When hundreds of millions are committed directly into interceptor procurement, production lines stabilize. Output becomes less volatile. Supply becomes less vulnerable to political turbulence. Volatility benefits the attacker. Stability benefits the defender. Russia expanded drone manufacturing to sustain pressure through volume. Britain's funding reinforces defensive volume in response. The exchange becomes harder to skew. There is also an artillery dimension. The wider UK package supports substantial shell deliveries through coordinated efforts. Air defense protects cities, artillery protects front lines. If both remain steady, the probability of sudden fracture declines. Fracture is what Moscow is looking for. Every reinforcement narrows that path. From the Kremlin's perspective, the problem is not the headline number, it is the mechanism behind it. When allies build systems that operate beyond political cycles, fatigue becomes less exploitable. And here's the clear fork Russia now faces. If interception rates rise even slightly, Moscow must either increase strike density, which burns through stockpiles faster, or accept reduced leverage from its air campaign. Both options carry cost. That is the quiet escalation embedded in this funding. Britain did not launch missiles. It altered the cost curve of Russia's missile strategy. If the next coordinated strike produces fewer visible results, something important shifts. The narrative of inevitability weakens. When inevitability weakens, coercion weakens. And when coercion weakens, strategy must change. This is not the first time Britain has changed the tempo of this war. In early 2022, the UK moved fast. Thousands of NLAWs were delivered before the invasion fully unfolded. Those lightweight anti-tank weapons didn't win the war, but they changed the opening narrative. Russian armored columns met resistance sooner than expected. That was tactical disruption. Then came heavier commitments. Britain transferred AS-90 self-propelled howitzers, giving Ukraine additional long-range artillery reach. It supplied armored vehicles. It expanded training programs under Operation Interflex, preparing thousands of Ukrainian troops on British soil. That was capability expansion. Then London crossed another line. Storm Shadow cruise missiles entered the battlefield. Suddenly, Ukraine could strike deep logistical nodes well beyond the front. Russian rear areas were no longer insulated by distance. That was strategic extension. Each phase escalated support, but all of those moves shared something in common. They were deliveries, hardware shipped, systems transferred, platforms deployed. This new package is different. This is not about sending Britain's inventory. It is about financing the pipeline that feeds Ukraine continuously. That is a structural shift. Instead of giving away what London already owns, Britain is now reinforcing the industrial bloodstream that sustains Ukraine's defense. Earlier packages altered battlefield dynamics. This package alters sustainability. That distinction matters. NLAWs influenced the first weeks. AS-90s influenced firepower balance. Storm Shadow influenced deep strike geometry. PURL funding influences duration. It signals that Britain is no longer reacting to events. It is investing in the system that allows Ukraine to absorb them. That is evolution, and evolution creates a more complicated problem for Moscow. Because Russia can adapt to platforms. Adapting to supply architecture is harder. The Kremlin does not react to press releases. It reacts to outcomes. And outcomes in this war are increasingly shaped by supply. Russia's long-range strike campaign has already evolved once. In the opening phase, missiles aimed to paralyze command centers and energy hubs. When paralysis failed, the objective shifted toward erosion. Infrastructure became a recurring target rather than a decisive one. Over time, the campaign hardened into something colder. Impose cost, drain interceptors, stretch production, wait for the defender to blink. That is the real logic behind the air war now. Cost pressure. Every interceptor Ukraine fires represents industrial effort on the western side. Russia mixes drones with cruise missiles because it wants expensive defensive launches triggered by cheaper threats. The more chaotic the wave, the more likely that defensive math becomes painful. Britain just attacked that pain point directly. By injecting funds into a NATO procurement channel already connected to American production lines, London reduced the lag between money and manufacturing. Delay is what Moscow tries to exploit. Delay feeds doubt, doubt feeds pressure. Shorten the delay and the pressure loses edge. There is another constraint rarely discussed publicly. Advanced cruise and ballistic missiles are not infinite resources. They depend on complex components and precision assembly. Sanctions forced adaptation, yet scaling remains limited compared to drone output. Drone production surged because it is easier to expand. Volume alone does not equal leverage. Volume becomes leverage only when defenders lack depth. This funding reinforces depth. If Ukrainian air defenses absorb a large strike package with limited visible impact, Moscow confronts a strategic fork: increase density and consume high-end missiles faster, or maintain current tempo and accept declining psychological effect. Neither path is comfortable. Airstrikes offered Russia a way to apply sustained pressure without additional mobilization waves or politically risky offensives. They projected power while avoiding images of costly ground failures. If air leverage narrows, the alternatives become heavier. There is also timing embedded in this decision. Russia has repeatedly targeted energy infrastructure as winter approaches. Cold multiplies the political and social weight of power outages. Darkness in January carries more strategic influence than darkness in July. Britain's funding lands before those calculations peak. That complicates the winter playbook. If interception rates hold during cold months, the intended message of vulnerability weakens. The impression of inevitability fades. European debates lose urgency. The pressure cycle softens. And if winter fails to produce strategic fatigue, Moscow's narrative about time favoring Russia becomes harder to sustain. Strategic patience depends on accurate expectations about an opponent's stamina. Misjudge that stamina and planning drifts. Drift invites risk. There is also a political layer inside NATO. PURL spreads procurement responsibility across multiple allies. That diffusion means a funding debate in one capital does not freeze the entire supply chain. Moscow has historically monitored those debates closely. Political friction has been part of the calculus. Structured procurement reduces that leverage. From the Kremlin's vantage point, this is uncomfortable because it limits opportunities to exploit hesitation. Britain's move does not guarantee perfect interception. No air defense system offers that. What it does is narrow the probability that air pressure alone reshapes the political landscape. Narrowed probability forces recalculation. If strike waves generate diminishing visible effect, Russian planners must reconsider emphasis. Adjust targeting philosophy, modify wave composition, rethink stockpile management. Each adaptation consumes time and resources. Time is a strategic asset. Resources are finite, and sustained logistics often decide who absorbs pressure more effectively. Britain's funding reinforces sustained logistics. That is why this is more than another aid announcement. It places quiet strain on the assumptions underpinning Russia's air campaign. If the sky over Ukraine becomes incrementally harder to penetrate, Moscow must either escalate its effort or accept reduced strategic return. Both outcomes complicate the Kremlin's planning horizon. Putin understands momentum. Momentum is not only about territory, it is about perception. If missile strikes keep landing, the impression builds that time favors the attacker. If cities endure repeated blackouts, fatigue becomes a weapon. Britain just interfered with that momentum, not through spectacle, through structure. When interceptor supply becomes steadier, interception rates stabilize. When interception rates stabilize, visible destruction declines. When visible destruction declines, the psychological edge of large strike waves weakens. And that edge has been central to Russia's leverage. There's also a broader strategic signal. Allies on NATO's eastern flank watch how systems perform under stress. They assess whether procurement mechanisms function under pressure. They measure whether coordination translates into real defensive effect. If Ukraine's air grid holds during intensified waves, deterrence credibility strengthens beyond Ukraine's borders. It suggests that pressure tactics aimed at fracturing coalitions are becoming less effective. That signal reaches Moscow. High-intensity missile campaigns are expensive. Production must keep pace, stockpiles must be managed, budgets must balance military spending against domestic needs. As long as airstrikes deliver visible leverage, those costs are politically defensible. If leverage shrinks, the political justification narrows with it. This is the part rarely discussed. If interception improves even marginally, Russia must either escalate strike density, accelerating missile consumption, or accept that each wave produces diminishing strategic effect. Escalation burns stockpiles faster. Restraint reduces pressure value. That is the box tightening around Moscow's air strategy. Britain's funding did not introduce new weapons to the battlefield overnight. It strengthened the system that keeps existing weapons flowing. Systems decide endurance. Endurance shapes negotiation leverage. If winter arrives and Russian strike waves fail to generate the expected political impact, the narrative that time favors Moscow weakens. When that narrative weakens, strategic patience becomes harder to sustain. This does not end the war. It shifts the balance inside one of its most important domains. Above the battlefield, in the sky, Putin sought to use that domain to bend perception toward inevitability. Britain just invested in bending it back toward resilience. And if the next wave produces more interceptions than explosions, the quiet decision that began with an invoice may prove more consequential than many louder announcements. Because wars do not always turn on dramatic offensives. Sometimes they turn on who controls the cost curve. And Britain just altered Russia's.